Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us here at FinTech Live Singapore. Time for another panel discussion now, and for me, a real highlight of the event, and that is women in FinTech. So let me welcome our guests today. They are Polina Katawa, Operations Executive at Financial Services Industry. Also joining us, Alice Chen, Co-founder and General Counsel at Investax, and Jessica Lum, Group Chief Strategy Officer at WeLab. Hi to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome indeed. Okay, we've got an awful lot to cover in the next half an hour, so let's push on into it. Where I want to start is about representation, because that is, well, it's an obvious place to start when we're talking about women in fintech and how we can address the current underrepresentation of women in the fintech industry. From all of your points of view, where do we stand on that at the moment, and how can we go about addressing it? And Alice, I'll start with you if we can, please.
Sure. I think just highlighting my industry, which is blockchain and crypto, seems to amplify the gender gap even more. I think the headlines, as you've seen, really highlight and amplify the presence of men, fewer women on stages, for sure. But I think there's a gender disparity across all finance and tech industries, and inevitably it leads to a lack of diversity at the senior and board levels. And so whenever I have a chance or the ability, I encourage a diverse presence on panels at management levels. I'm also at a stage where I think younger women in the industry are looking at me as a mentor. So I try to do my part to represent women in the best possible light and to demonstrate that you can be in this fast-paced, demanding industry, still maintain a social life and family, and try to do all the things that you love doing. And so I really try to adopt the model of, the inclusion starts with I, and what I do at home with my daughter, at work as a founder, I try to lead by example, so setting the tone from the top. Until we get to a point where there is gender equity, I think these types of discussions and panels still need to happen, but we're not there yet.
Absolutely. Jessica, if we can come to you next on that, please.
The first thing I say is it's always about see it, be it, right? So the fact that we're here right now and being visible is a massive, massive step. So see it, be it is a quote that, I learned from athletes, actually, because when people think about athletes and role models out there, there's nothing more powerful than seeing someone who's very similar to yourself, whether it's physically or otherwise, and then you feel like, oh, if they can do it, I can do that, right? We're about the same height, we're about the same build, maybe similar education background, and once you start ticking those boxes, that typically does help a lot. And that struck a chord with me when someone came up to me after a panel, probably about 8 years ago at Bloomberg, and they said, we don't see a lot of Asian females in the finance industry speaking at these panels, talking about female empowerment, because the others were Caucasian on the panel, and they're like, thank you for being up there, because that see it, be it moment actually made me feel a little bit more comfortable. And so I'm really grateful for that little piece of feedback that came from those two individual girls, because I didn't know the power, the impact of what I had in there. So I think that is very much the first step in which we're doing, which is a see it, be it moment. Visibility helps. What I would say in terms of gender representation, look, what I would say is we need to do this based on merit, right? It shouldn't be, my opinion, it shouldn't be a quota or anything to that effect. We should be hiring based on meritocracy and skill sets and what have you, but do recognize that whether it's diversity of backgrounds or cultural differences or personalities add a certain flavor and element to it, and of which one of these diversity elements is actually gender. So for me, I think it's, or my company, it's a lot more about awareness and bringing this to the forefront and talking about this and being aware of it. But in terms of the specifics of whether this is a quote unquote problem or not, I would say we need to break it down into micro sections in terms of the specific issue on hand and how to address it. But visibility is and talking about it is absolutely the first step, which I think we've come a long way.
Absolutely. We'll get on to some of the practical steps we can take shortly. Pauline, if we can come to you last on representation, about how we can address the current underrepresentation of women in fintech. For you, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, it was interesting hearing what Alice said when she started around her own industry and what she's seeing. Just to maybe just give you some of the stats I was looking at, when you look at the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, there's about 7% of women that have made CEO. And when you look at the New York Stock Exchange, 6% of women. And that's not to say being a CEO is end and all. However, when you look at even their exos and their executive teams, it's also predominantly women, which really supports what she's seeing in the industry. It's like a trend going on in the rest of the world.
Pauline, if I could just ask you just to rotate your camera back to how it was, because you're now coming through sideways. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem at all. I know you're having some technical issues, so we do appreciate you've persevered to join us. Okay, well, let's move on to how we break some of those barriers and make effective changes, because I'm sure there's plenty of people watching who are an ally, if you want, who want to do the right thing, but maybe aren't sure how to do it. They might look around their boardroom, they look around their senior management team and go, this is all very male, there isn't much diversity here. What can you actually do to make effective changes whilst also making sure everyone is there on merit? And I'll start with Jessica, if we can start with you on this one, please.
First thing, absolutely, I think, is awareness, right? You always need to start with awareness in terms of everything you do, recognizing that, this could be something we need to look into. I'm not going to say it's a problem, because it's not a problem, but it's something that we should be aware of. So awareness is the first thing. And secondly, it is, recognizing that we need to find a way to do it. And there is no one size fits all. It depends on your organization. It depends on, the cast of characters that you have on hand and what do you want to achieve at the end of the day. Is it baby steps? Is it revolutionizing everything? But it comes down to, okay, are there particular guidelines that if we look at some of the larger organizations or peers in the industry, what are some of the best practices that we should take into account, right? I think, I mentioned this briefly, there was a strong, in some jurisdictions, they have certain quotas in terms of the male-female ratio on boards and requirements for that. And some it's an encouragement, and some it's just about reporting and disclosure. So where do you fit on that spectrum? And that also depends on your industry, right? Certain industry, if it's a very technical one and you need specialists in that area, and if you look at the availability of talent in that particular field, it may be more stretched. If you're required to have a certain, quantity of females, then it may not be the way to do it. So I think, first of all, it's really understanding what are the best practices in the world or, within your industry, and narrowing down what fits for you depending the size and scale of your company. A large multinational bank would be very different from a FinTech a startup, for example, who may or may not have the bandwidth or the resources and so on and so forth. So, I do think it is an exercise worth studying with your select group of the management team or the founders team. And also make sure that if this is a founder-led company or if it's a reasonably tight management team, that this is in line with the company's mission, right? And the ethos of what there is. Because if you're trying to fit, a round what do you call it, round plug into like a square peg or whatever, it's not going to work, and it's not going to be natural, and it won't be sustainable either. So I think those are sort of the first steps I would suggest.
Pauline, if we can come to you next with this one, please.
It's interesting. I think when you look at the practical things people are doing in the workplace as opposed to how it all really starts, because that's something that I'm really interested in and I've been looking at. Just in terms of my own experience, I was probably, I would say about 8 years old in Harare, where I was born, when my dad said to me, you know what, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. And I'm talking being in a very underprivileged space, like Jessica was mentioning, in terms of her own experience being in one of 17 children, so there wasn't money for schooling. But what it basically meant was opportunities are endless. You have a silver spoon because when you believe that you can make it, you will make it. And since then, it's really lived to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then this is a man that had barely the college grade 6 then, standard 1 or something. And then fast forward, when I met my father-in-law 15 years ago, he told me, like, you can make it. And it's that awareness to echo what you said previously, but also the people that are deliberate, that are in families, really empowering our young girls.
Alice Chen, if we can come to you next, please.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Jessica mentioned earlier in terms of just meritocracy, right? We really need to be viewing, not labeling and having quotas in place, but just promoting more of a meritocracy in the workplace. And aside from just company policies, hiring policies, et cetera, it comes back to the individual. Again, I think there is a disparity in how men and women operate. I think the first step that women need to do more of is just ask for help, ask for a raise, and just be heard, be visible, all of that. You know, the basics of what I think a lot of people take for granted. A lot of women are afraid to ask. So another point I did want to raise is also oftentimes we say women need to support women, but oftentimes women are seen as the biggest competitors and are not truly encouraging other women. I had my own personal experience with this when I started working with a female partner who wanted to demonstrate all of the ways that the difficulties that she went through, and put all of the young lawyers through the same process. And that's not really uplifting or supporting women. And so I think it's about being leaders in FinTech, taking away the preconceptions and the stereotypes that we may all have, consciously or subconsciously, and really basing it on meritocracy. I'm sure we all make these judgment calls when we see someone walk in, how they're dressed, how they look, and we may hire based on those preconceptions. And I think we need to just take those biases away. And honestly, some of my biggest supporters have been men. And so we need to also foster an environment where our male counterparts can see the value of having diversity represented. Yeah.
Well, you were touching there on some of the qualities, Alice, and I'd like to stay with that with you just for a moment before I come to you, Paulina and Jessica. What particular leadership qualities and strategies are essential for a woman in the FinTech marketplace at the moment to really demonstrate the merit that they have in that role? Do you have any advice on that?
As in what types of qualities? Again, I would emphasize we shouldn't say whether these are female versus male qualities, but just qualities in general to survive in a startup or a FinTech. I always joke, because I'm a startup founder, it takes a little bit of crazy to be a founder. It takes a lot of resilience. If we really break it down, it means someone who has thick skin, who's going to get up on their feet after repeated beatdowns, someone who's not going to take no for an answer, passionate, resilient, risk taker, because oftentimes you're going to put everything on the line to get to your dream. You've got to face your fears. My biggest fear was really giving up everything that I had achieved up to that date, going to law school, practicing law at a big law firm, failing my parents, failing our investors, taking money, external funding, and all of the fears of failing myself and everyone who's depending on me, and just trudging on. I think it just takes a little bit of crazy. That's how I would label all of that into one bucket.
Yeah, it's a good kind of crazy, though. We'll definitely take that. It takes a good kind of crazy to be in the studio here today as well. Paulina, I'll come to you next in terms of those kind of qualities.
It's interesting hearing what Alice said. Actually, I liked that a lot when she said, let's be very careful about differentiating between men and women. I was having a conversation with my therapist, actually, it was yesterday on Monday, and I was saying to her, how many people do you see walk in the room? Is it more men, more women? Do you feel like how women are treated when they are growing up has an impact on how they end up operating as executives? And she said something very interesting. She was like, you know what, Paul, actually, I see men that come in and they're broken, but because they haven't been taught or been nurtured. And what they say is, I wanted a hug. I wanted to be nurtured. So in our quest to promote women, it's very important not to forget the men as well, because they want to be nurtured, so they know how to promote, how to be deliberate. And another, I think, a case in point around the qualities is, if you look at the world today, just outside of FinTech and all the companies, they're really moving towards a digitally transformed environment. And one of the key qualities, I'll say, being open-minded. I like what Alice, I think, Jessica, you said, just ask. Was it Alice? You said, just ask. So being open-minded means you don't know what you don't know. You go in with the attitude, I can just ask. And similar to you, I've also had men that I've worked with that have really, really supported me in my quest to grow. And in being open-minded, you learn things that you're very uncomfortable with. So I've moved from being a chartered accountant. I was tasked to run one of the biggest separation projects, heading up finance by the then CFO of ABSA, the Barclays Group, when Barclays was separating from Barclays Africa. So Jason Quinn is now the CEO at one of the biggest banks in South Africa, before I moved to Australia, obviously. And I mean, this is a man that just took a chance. And probably I was 5% less competent, I believe, than other people there, but he did really take a chance, and I was open-minded to the learning. Yeah.
Thank you. Jessica, if we can come to you next on that.
Yeah, so my takeaway is that Paul and Alice and myself were all a little bit of crazy. So I think that was a good takeaway from all that. And I'm going to co-sign on that point there. I feel that, those of us who, we don't set an invisible ceiling for ourselves, right? I think a lot of the time what you hear a lot is men and women, different characteristics. One of them is the confidence that men tend to have more of. Now, this is obviously broad strokes and big picture, not individuals, right? But some of the characteristics are, women tend to set invisible ceilings for themselves. And so I guess the thing I would say, whether it's men or women, anyone as an individual, the first thing I would say is, why don't you take a step and check yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Write down what your own attributes are, recognize what your own strengths and weaknesses are, and get a friend to go through them with you and ask them, is this a good profile of me, right? Or get a colleague or a mentor or someone just to check yourselves, because we need to just, take stock of who we are every now and then, because you can't influence others, right? So even as leaders, we can't influence others if we don't stop and check ourselves, right? And make sure that we are, aware of our own strengths and weaknesses, and continuously working on areas where we want to be better, or so on and so forth, right? Whether that's confidence, asking questions, asking for pay rises, saying yes when you only have 5% of the competency, all that stuff. It actually starts with you as an individual recognizing that, rather than relying on someone else to recognize that in you, right? So maybe it's me going to Alice and saying, hey, Alice, it's something that I'm interested in, and I'm pretty good at it, and actually tell her, rather than waiting for Alice to approach me afterwards and saying, hey, Jessica, I thought that was pretty good of you. Would you be interested? What's the downside if Alice says no? I'd be like, okay, sure, no problem. It's good to connect. So I think it's about recognizing that being rejected is not failure. It's actually okay. It's the cliche of you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, right? Wayne Gretzky. It's exactly that, but I think we need to overcome the fear in terms of what is the worst case scenario if that happens, right? You'll be embarrassed, but is Alice going to go on social media and say something mean about you? It's like, oh my gosh, yesterday Jessica came up to me and asked me this question, and it was a dumb question. No, she won't, right? So I think you just need to put it into like how we do risk assessments, right? What is the absolute worst case that could happen? You ask for a pay rise, your boss says no. Okay, but if you don't ask, you're never going to get that pay rise. So I think we just need to start checking ourselves, in context and think about it a little bit more. So I think this is where it's not an imparting speech, but I'll encourage everyone, man, woman, whatever you identify, it doesn't matter. Each individual person, whether it's Alice, whether it's Paul's, whether it's myself, we should go check ourselves, right? Where do we stand right now? Why are we shortchanging ourselves if we are? And what should we do next?
Oh, Jessica, I'll definitely allow you that cliche as well, because it's such a good one. Wayne Gretzky got that one spot on. One thing I do want to move on to, though, is we take these event series around the world. We do them London, New York, to Dubai, which we've got coming up, and Singapore at the moment. How crucial is it that we recognise the different speeds of progress in different parts of the world? Because a strategy that may work in Europe when it comes to diversity might work very well in Europe or the US or in Africa or Australasia, might work differently and play differently in different regions. How do we go about recognising the speed of change may be different in different parts of the world? Alice, can I start with you on this one, please?
Yeah, actually, I did have just some commentary on what Jessica has started earlier, which is about, the individual perspective. And I think that comes from both sides. As a leader, having policies in place, again, I go back to that word inclusion, starts with the word I, right? What can I do as a founder, as a leader? How can I be inclusive? But at the same time, as the person seeking a role or going after something, you have to take the action. And again, going back to what I said earlier, and take action and ask. So, but yeah, I really liked what Jessica said. So now coming back to your question, I think, yes, we definitely have to come and account for the different cultural, expectations and how things are moving in different jurisdictions. I've been lucky enough to grow up. I was born in China, grew up in the US, and then came back to Asia to work. I have noticed differences in how things operate, and it varies from one region in Asia to another. I worked in Japan, I worked in Shanghai, I'm working now in Singapore. And of course, there are cultural norms. Sometimes I did not feel comfortable accepting those cultural norms, but we do, over time, I realize it is something that we have to take into account. This is, you can't change centuries old customs overnight. But I do see things changing. In Japan, for example, more women are in the workplace. There aren't as much of that hierarchical seniority system that I saw when I first moved to Japan. So, but we do have to account for the differences and not try to impose our views immediately in different settings and environments. That's just my own personal observation. Otherwise, you will end up being very unhappy. But those are my own personal views.
Absolutely. Well, I think you've got the perspective to have them, having worked and lived in different parts of the world. Paulina, if we can come to you next on that, sort of appreciating the differences depending on where you are in the world and the progress that's being made in different areas.
No, 100%. So what Jess said was so interesting for me. There's a quote I really love by Trevor Noah. He's South African and moved to the US, and he says, rejection is an answer, fear is an answer, failure is an answer, regret is the thing we should fear the most, what if? So I liked what you said, like going to ask for a raise and they say no, that's an answer, but not going to ask because it's a rejection. So very interesting concept. Just in terms of other women, what's happening in the world, I mean, I've got some great examples of women that are doing amazing things. My sister and my best friend runs all of tricks and legal for Deloitte Africa, and she works a lot with the different global partners. So when she discusses some of the things they're doing around digital transformation, a topic I'm really passionate about, where they are looking at every time you're learning, you probe, you sense, and you act. I think the framework is called FinTech framework. Spelled CY, Citizen, but it's FinTech. So when I look at that and the what I mentioned earlier, wanting to learn, being open-minded, which is, by the way, they say the real difference between great companies and average companies is the speed of execution and learning. So when I see that in an African country, but they're executing at a global level, that's like, wow, okay, that's interesting. And having also moved from, I was born in Harare, Zimbabwe. I lived in South Africa 20 years, and now I've moved to Australia from November last year with my family. And when I walk in NAB, like their banks here at Australian, New Zealand Bank, I honestly come with skills that I'm like, okay, so we're actually learning something in Africa. So it's interesting when you have those perspectives on global countries.
Jessica?
I mean, I think they've said it all. But all I would say to what Alice's point is, you just need to understand the local customs, right? So I think everything is on a scale. So you just need to, be cognizant and read the room and read the culture in terms of, which part of that scale you're willing to push. What I would say is the bookends are the bookends, right? But your aim is to move as far away from the bookend as possible, to the extent that you can give nudges, right, encouragement for someone to be aware. And I think a lot of it sometimes is, if it's a traditional or a larger organization, it may actually be harder for change management to happen because of inertia. However, I do think sometimes it's because people don't know what they should think or what other best practices are. So a lot of the times it's a see it, be it, which is, hey, there's an example of this other company that does this. What do you think? So sometimes it's about first introducing the concept and then letting it digest through osmosis. But there is no one size fits all. It really depends on the size and scale of the organization, the industry, the people that you have. It's always easier to motivate 20 people as opposed to 2,000. But if you are part of a large organization, then you always need champions, right? Champions to cascade the message across the different groups or factions and so on and so forth. And I'm sure someone who's part of the organization would know that best. But I would also say look for external help. You don't always have to do it internally, right? Think about it. Why do we always get guest speakers? It's always more effective to get an external party to be the influencer, right? Whether it's a KOL, KOC, or an athlete, or whatever, is appealing, right? Sometimes hearing it from a third party is more inspiring. So I think these are some of the little techniques that we can consider as an organization in terms of what will be the mess. Maybe hearing from a third party is more inspirational than hearing from me. Perfectly happy with that. I'm very results oriented. So whatever works, happy to pursue that route.
All great advice. And as we were talking about cliches earlier, you're going to have to forgive me, but I'm going to ask the most cliched closing question to a panel earlier when you've only got about 4 minutes left. And that's one final piece of advice you'd give to any women working in the fintech space, technology space, who are watching this today. What would that one piece of advice be that you'd give them? And if you could keep this to 30 seconds to a minute, I'd be very grateful. Paulina, we'll start with you, please.
I'd say don't regret, don't do it and don't regret. I started by saying my dad really empowered me, told me I was great, and he did that the rest of my life. About 4 weeks ago, I lost him, unfortunately. And he's a reminder every day that, you know what, you'd rather not have regrets and go for your ambitions.
Alice, if we can come to you next, please, on that piece of advice.
Well, you know what they say. I think if you love what you do, you don't have to work a day in your life, right? And I actually, a lot of people ask me, why did you do this? And I actually truly believe that we are perhaps laying the foundations of a new financial system, and excites me. And if you do anything, it should excite you, because this is going to be a journey, and it's not going to be rosy all the time, but you must be passionate about what you do, and it's not just about the paycheck and the big exit, but for me, it's really about this profound sense of having a purpose that drives me. So, and forget all the headlines. The headlines will say, it's harder for women, but as you've seen here, if you want to do it, there's support out there. I didn't have a tech background, and I felt very deep into the Web3 space, and here I am. So anyone can do it.
Absolutely. And Jessica, I'll give you the pleasure of wrapping things up on this, that one piece of advice.
So I learned from Alice today that the I in inclusion, or the I in everything that you do, I was taught growing up at a firm that it's always about we. It's the power of the team rather than I, and that's what we used to write in pitch books and everything. I still believe in that. However, I think the message I would say here is you are the one who's in control of your own life and your own journey and your own destiny, right? So I think here I would encourage everyone that you are the most important person in the world, right? You as an individual, right? It's not about, no offense, your kids, your family, or everyone. No, you yourself. Because if you don't make sure that your mental health, your physical health is in good shape, you can't take care of the people around you, right? If you're on an airplane in turbulence, you put your mask on first before your child. Because if you're not in good health, you can't do anything else for anyone else around you, right? So first of all, it is invest in yourself, whether it's me time or anything else. And then at the end of the day, you can only control the controllables. So that is my mantra in life, which is don't worry, don't freak out, don't worry about rejection. It's not going to help. Control the controllables. Do what you can do, invest in yourself, and be the best you.
Superb. That is some of the best advice I've heard in about 4 or 5 minutes on one of these stages. So thank you to all of you. I hope you forgive me the terribly cliched end question, but it seemed an excellent way to finish. Polina, Alice, Jessica, thanks so much for joining us here at FinTech Live Singapore.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.